The night air was cold as Daniel and Zira moved through the wreckage of the battlefield. Every step was careful, every sound met with tense silence. They had made a plan. Find an abandoned ship, steal it, and fly straight into Scifi territory. It was insane, but it was their only hope. Daniel kept his rifle ready as they walked. There used to be an outpost nearby, he said. Human and Scifi ships crashed there during the battle. If we're lucky, one might still work. Zira glanced at him. And if we're not lucky? Daniel smirked. Then we die. She rolled her eyes. Encouraging. They moved quickly through the ruins. The ground was littered with broken weapons, shattered armor, and the remains of soldiers, both human and Scifi. The war had left nothing but destruction. After an hour of walking, they reached the outpost, or what was left of it. The buildings were half collapsed, smoke still rising from some areas. Scattered wreckage of ships lay across the ground. Daniel crouched behind a fallen wall and scanned the area. Looks abandoned, he muttered. Zira knelt beside him. Or it's a trap. Daniel sighed. Only one way to find out. They moved forward carefully, stepping over debris. Zira winced as she walked, still weak from her wounds, but she kept going. Then Daniel spotted it, half buried under rubble. A Scifi fighter. It was damaged, but the core engine looked intact. If they could get it running, they had a chance. There, he whispered. Zira's eyes widened. That's a Royal-class interceptor. Fast, armed, and coded for Scifi use. Daniel grinned. Perfect. Let's get inside. They rushed to the ship, clearing debris from the entrance. Zira climbed inside first, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. The cockpit was damaged, but the core systems still had power. Daniel watched as she worked. Can you fly it? Zira gave him a sharp look. I am a princess, not a child. Of course, I can fly it. Daniel held up his hands. Just checking, Your Highness. She rolled her eyes and pressed a few buttons. The ship hummed to life, dim blue lights flickering on. Daniel exhaled. We might actually pull this off. Then a voice echoed through the ruins. Over there, movement near the wreckage. Daniel's blood went cold. He turned to see a squad of human soldiers approaching, weapons raised. Zira cursed. They must have been watching the outpost. Daniel grabbed his rifle. Get that ship running. I'll hold them off. Zira hesitated, then nodded. Do not die, human. Daniel smirked. No promises. He stepped outside, raising his weapon as the soldiers closed in. The war wasn't over yet, and if they wanted to escape, they'd have to fight for it. Smoke and ash filled the air as Sergeant Daniel Cross moved through the ruins of the battlefield. The war between humanity and the Scifi had raged for years, leaving planets like this one in complete devastation. Bodies of both human and alien soldiers lay scattered, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place just hours ago. Daniel adjusted his rifle and scanned the area. His orders were clear. Search for any human survivors and eliminate any wounded enemies. The Scifi were ruthless warriors, known for their honor in battle, but also their hatred of humanity. If the roles were reversed, Daniel knew they wouldn't hesitate to kill him. But as he stepped over the wreckage of a fallen dropship, he heard something. A faint sound. A breath. He turned sharply, his weapon ready. Lying between two pieces of shattered metal was a figure, an alien woman. Her silver armor was cracked, and deep wounds covered her body. Her golden skin, now stained with dark purple blood, barely rose and fell as she struggled to breathe. Daniel hesitated. His training told him to finish the job. The Scifi were enemies. Kill or be killed. That was the rule of war. But as he looked into her face, he saw something unexpected. Fear, pain, desperation. She was still conscious, her glowing violet eyes locking onto his. She didn't beg. She didn't speak. She only looked at him, as if accepting whatever fate he chose for her. Daniel clenched his jaw. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Against every instinct, against every order, he knelt beside her and pulled out his medical kit. The moment he touched her, she flinched, her breath hitching in pain. "Easy," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't respond, but she also didn't resist. Her body was too weak. Daniel worked quickly, sealing her worst wounds with biofoam and wrapping makeshift bandages around her injuries. He had no idea why he was doing this. Maybe it was the way she looked at him. Maybe he was just tired of all the killing. Or maybe, deep down, he refused to believe that mercy was weakness. When he was done, he took a deep breath and glanced around. Staying here was too dangerous. If his squad found him helping an enemy, they'd shoot her on sight and probably arrest him for treason. If the Scifi found them, they'd kill him first and take her away. There was only one choice. He carefully lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she was. She made a weak sound of protest, but she didn't have the strength to fight back. Yeah, I know," he muttered. "This is a terrible idea." With one last look at the battlefield, Daniel turned and disappeared into the ruins, carrying the enemy he was supposed to let die. The stars stretched endlessly before them, but the real challenge lay ahead. Zyra's hands tightened on the controls as their ship entered Scifi space. Warning signals flashed. Her people had detected them. Daniel glanced at her. "So what's the plan? You think they'll roll out a red carpet for us?" Zyra smirked. "More like a fleet of warships." As if on cue, the radar lit up. A formation of massive Scifi battleships appeared, blocking their path. Within seconds, the comm system crackled to life. "Unidentified vessel, you are entering restricted space. Identify yourself or be destroyed." Zyra took a deep breath and pressed the transmission button. "This is Zyra Valkyrin, heir to the throne. Stand down." Silence. Then a different voice, deeper and full of authority. "Impossible. The princess is dead." Daniel muttered under his breath. "Well, this is going well." Zyra leaned forward. "I am very much alive. Open a secure channel to my father. Now." Another pause. Then a response. "Proceed to docking bay 12. Any attempt to flee will result in immediate termination." Daniel sighed. Comforting. The ship moved forward, escorted by Scifi fighters. Daniel felt the tension in the air. If this went wrong, they wouldn't leave alive. As they landed inside the massive flagship, Zyra stood up. She was still weak, but she straightened her back, lifting her chin like the royal she was. Daniel followed her out of the ship, hands raised slightly to show he wasn't a threat. A group of heavily armed Scifi soldiers surrounded them. Then, from the shadows, a towering figure emerged, Zyra's father, High King Valkyrin. His piercing silver eyes locked onto Zyra, filled with disbelief and fury. "You dare bring a human into our home?" he growled. Zyra met his gaze, unflinching. "This human saved my life. Without him, I would be dead." The High King's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe that?" Daniel stepped forward. "Believe what you want, but it's the truth." The Scifi soldiers tensed, ready to strike, but Zyra raised a hand. "Father, listen to me. The war has taken enough. We can keep fighting, or we can find another way." The High King studied her, then turned to Daniel. "Why did you save her?" Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "Because it was the right thing to do." The High King was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "The War Council will decide your fate, human. If you have changed my daughter's mind, perhaps you will change mine as well." Zyra exhaled softly. It wasn't victory, yet, but it was a chance. As they were led inside the palace, Daniel muttered, "So, do I bow or something?" Zyra smirked. "Just try not to get yourself executed." Daniel chuckled. "No promises." And with that, their fight for peace had just begun. The wasteland stretched endlessly before them, dry, broken, and silent. Daniel led the way, his rifle slung across his back. Zira followed, her steps slower but determined. Though she was still weak, she refused to show it. Daniel had seen that kind of pride before, soldiers who wouldn't admit when they were hurt. He respected it, but right now, it was dangerous. "You should rest," he said without looking back. Zira scoffed. "I am not weak." Daniel smirked. "Never said you were. But even the strongest warriors need a break." Zira exhaled sharply, but she didn't argue. She hated that he was right. Finally, they found an old wreckage site, twisted metal, and shattered vehicles from an old battle. Daniel spotted a half-buried supply crate and pried it open. Inside, he found a few ration packs. Not much, but enough to keep them going. He tossed one to Zira. She caught it but hesitated. "Human food." He shrugged. "It won't kill you." Zira gave him a suspicious look before taking a bite. Her expression remained neutral, but Daniel noticed how quickly she ate. She must have been starving. As they sat in the shadows of the wreckage, Daniel finally spoke the question that had been on his mind. "You're not just a soldier, are you?" Zira stiffened slightly. She took a moment before answering. "No." Daniel leaned forward. "Then who are you?" She met his gaze, her violet eyes unreadable. "My full name is Zira Valkaren. I am heir to the auxiliary throne." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A princess. He had saved the enemy's princess. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he let out a short laugh. "Great, so I didn't just commit treason. I committed high treason." Zira smirked. "Yes, it would seem so." Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked away. "Because humans would rather kill auxiliary than help them." "If you had known, would you still have saved me?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I would have." Zira studied him, as if searching for any sign of a lie. But she found none. Before she could respond, a low growl echoed through the wreckage. Daniel froze. He recognized that sound. A ravager. He grabbed his rifle and scanned the darkness. A massive four-legged beast emerged from the shadows, its yellow eyes glowing. It was a scavenger, drawn by the scent of blood. Zira reached for her blade, but she was still too weak. The creature lunged. Daniel fired. The ravager roared in pain but didn't stop. It circled them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, Zira suddenly pushed off the ground and lunged at the beast. With one swift motion, she drove her blade into its throat. The creature let out a final gurgle before collapsing. Daniel stared at her, impressed. "Not bad." Zira smirked, wiping the blood from her blade. "I told you, I am not weak." For the first time, Daniel didn't just see her as an enemy. He saw a warrior. And maybe, just maybe, an ally. Daniel pushed open the rusted door of an old supply bunker and stepped inside. The place had been abandoned long ago, but it would have to do. He carried the wounded alien woman in his arms, her breathing shallow but steady. He knew he was taking the huge risk, but he couldn't leave her to die. Carefully, he laid her down on a pile of old blankets in the corner. She winced, but didn't make a sound. Even in pain, she was strong. He admired that, though he wouldn't say it out loud. Daniel grabbed a small lantern and lit it, casting a dim glow across the room. He crouched beside her, checking her wounds again. The biofoam was working, sealing the deeper cuts, but she had lost a lot of blood. She needed rest. The alien woman's violet eyes slowly opened, locking onto him. She tensed, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach for a weapon, but she was too weak. "You're safe," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't reply, just stared at him with unreadable eyes. Daniel sighed and leaned back. "Do you understand me?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a rough, quiet voice, she spoke. "Why? Help me?" Her words were broken, but clear enough. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. Why did he help her? Because he didn't want more blood on his hands. Because he saw something human in her, even though she wasn't. Didn't want to let you die, he said finally. Her eyes narrowed slightly, like she didn't believe him. He couldn't blame her. Humanity and the Xilari had been at war for years. Mercy wasn't something either side showed often. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her body, and she gasped. Daniel reached out instinctively, but she jerked away. Even injured, she didn't trust him. Easy, he muttered. You need to rest. She didn't argue, but she didn't relax either. Daniel stood up and walked to a small supply crate, pulling out a canteen of water. He knelt beside her again and held it out. Drink, he said. She eyed the canteen suspiciously, then took it with shaky hands. She sipped slowly, as if expecting poison. When nothing happened, she drank more. Daniel watched her carefully. She was different from the other Xilari he had fought. There was something regal about her. Her posture, the way she carried herself, even now. Got a name? He asked. She hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she said, Zyra. Daniel nodded. I'm Daniel. For the first time, her expression softened, just a little. They were still enemies. But for now, in this forgotten bunker, surrounded by war, they were just two survivors, and that was enough. Daniel moved quickly through the ruins, keeping low. The human patrol was too close, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. One wrong move, and they'd be caught. Behind him, Zara struggled to keep up. She was still weak, her body not fully healed. Daniel glanced back and saw her breathing heavily, her steps unsteady. She was tough, but even she had limits. He reached out, grabbing her arm to steady her. Stay with me, he whispered. Zara's pride made her want to pull away, but she knew this wasn't the time to argue. She nodded, forcing herself to focus. A voice echoed through the ruins. Check the bunker. Make sure no Xilari scum are hiding. Daniel cursed under his breath. They were running out of time. He scanned the area and spotted an old drainage tunnel ahead. It was half buried under rubble, but it might be their only chance. This way, he said, leading Zyra toward it. She hesitated for a moment, then followed. They'd reached the tunnel entrance just as the soldiers entered the bunker. Daniel pulled Zyra inside, pressing against the cold metal wall. Seconds later, they heard voices nearby. There's nothing here, one soldier grumbled. Keep looking. Command says no survivors, another replied. Daniel held his breath. Beside him, Zyra was completely still, her body tense. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity until the footsteps finally faded into the distance. Zyra exhaled softly. That was too close. Daniel nodded. Yeah, we need to get as far from here as possible. They followed the tunnel for a while, until they emerged into the wasteland outside the ruined city. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind thick smoke. The land stretched before them, dry, broken, and lifeless. Zara looked around, her expression unreadable. Where will you go? Daniel adjusted his rifle. There's an old supply station a few miles from here. We can rest there. Zara raised an eyebrow. We? He smirked. Unless you want to go on your own. She crossed her arms. I do not need your help. Daniel chuckled. Sure. That's why you're barely standing. Zira glared at him, but she didn't argue. She hated to admit it, but she needed him, at least for now. They started walking, the silence between them heavy. Daniel kept a steady pace, making sure she could keep up. He had so many questions, who she really was, why she was so important, but he didn't push her. They weren't just running from soldiers anymore. They were running from the war itself. And for the first time, Daniel wondered if they could ever escape it. Daniel sat near the entrance of the bunker, his rifle resting across his lap. Outside, the night was cold and silent, but he knew danger was never far. Human patrols were searching for survivors, and the HFY would be looking for their lost warriors. If either side found them, it wouldn't end well. Behind him, Zyra stirred. She was healing, but slowly. Her golden skin still looked pale, and her movements were weak. But her sharp violet eyes were alert, watching everything. She was studying him, just as he was studying her. "You're a soldier," she said suddenly. Her voice was stronger than before. Daniel glanced at her. "Yeah." She tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you save me?" He sighed. It was the same question she had asked before, and he still didn't have a good answer. "Didn't seem right to let you die," he said simply. Zyra's eyes narrowed. "Humans and Scifi, we do not show mercy to each other." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe that's the problem." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Zyra shifted, trying to sit up. Daniel moved to help her, but she glared at him. "I can do it," she said, her pride refusing his aid. Daniel smirked. "Yeah, sure." She struggled, but eventually she sat upright, her back resting against the cold wall. She looked exhausted, but there was determination in her eyes. "We can't stay here," she said. "Your people will find you. They will think you are a traitor." Daniel knew she was right. If the human forces found him hiding an enemy soldier, no, an enemy woman he had saved, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd execute him on the spot. "What about you?" he asked. "Your people will come looking too." Zyra's expression darkened. She looked away. "They believe I am dead." Daniel frowned. There was something in her voice, a hesitation, a secret she wasn't telling him. "Why?" he pressed. She exhaled slowly, as if debating whether to answer. "Finally," she said, "because I am important to them." Daniel's instincts flared. She's not just a soldier. Before he could ask more, a sound outside made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps, voices, a human patrol. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. He crept toward the door and peered outside. 5 soldiers, scanning the ruins with flashlights. Too close. He turned back to Zyra. "We have to go. Now." Zyra gritted her teeth and forced herself to stand. She swayed, but Daniel caught her arm. This time, she didn't push him away. They had no choice. If they stayed, they'd die. If they ran, they might have a chance. Without another word, they slipped out the back of the bunker and into the night, 2 enemies fleeing together, hunted by both their worlds. The enemy fighters were closing in fast. Red warning lights flashed across the cockpit as Zyra gritted her teeth, gripping the controls. Daniel, seated beside her, quickly activated the weapons system. 2 on the left, 1 coming in from above, Daniel called out. Zyra spun the ship into a sharp roll, dodging a barrage of laser fire. The human fighters were sleek, built for speed, but Zyra's interceptor was faster. Daniel locked onto the nearest fighter and fired. A bright blue energy blast shot from their cannons, hitting its wing. The enemy ship spun out of control before exploding in a flash of fire. "1 down," Daniel shouted. Zyra smirked. "Try to keep up." She twisted the controls, sending their ship into a sudden dive. The force pressed Daniel against his seat as they dropped through the atmosphere of a barren moon. The remaining fighters followed, their lasers lighting up the darkness. Zyra's fingers moved swiftly over the controls. "The ship's shields won't last long." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Then let's end this fast." He waited for the right moment. The 2 enemy fighters were closing in, trying to box them in. A mistake. "Hold steady," Daniel muttered, his finger hovering over the trigger. Zyra gave him a sharp glance. "I hope you know what you're doing." The enemy ships fired. Zyra jerked the controls at the last second, dodging 1 blast while another grazed their wing. Sparks flew, but they were still flying. Now, Daniel pressed the trigger. Their ship's cannons roared, sending a storm of plasma toward the enemy. The first fighter took a direct hit and exploded. The second tried to evade, But Zara spun the ship sideways, lining up a perfect shot for Daniel. He didn't miss. The last fighter erupted into flames, breaking apart in the sky. Daniel let out a breath. That was too close. Zara nodded, focusing back on the navigation screen. We're clear, for now. The stars stretched before them as they left the battlefield behind. Daniel leaned back. All right, princess. We made it. Now what? Zara's violet eyes gleamed. Now, we go home. She set a course for Xilari territory, her expression unreadable. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a princess returning home. She was returning with a human by her side. And she had no idea what would happen next. Daniel took cover behind a broken engine, gripping his rifle tightly. The human soldiers spread out, their weapons aimed at the wreckage. He recognized their armor, elite enforcers, trained to eliminate any threat without hesitation. One of them stepped forward. Drop your weapon and surrender. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Yeah, that's not happening. Without warning, he fired. His first shot hit the nearest soldier in the shoulder, knocking him back. The others reacted instantly, bullets ripping through the air. Daniel ducked behind the engine as sparks flew. He returned fire, keeping their attention away from the ship. Inside the cockpit, Zara worked fast. Her fingers danced over the controls, rerouting power and bypassing damaged systems. The ship's engines groaned as they struggled to activate. Come on, she thought. Outside, Daniel was running low on ammo. The soldiers were advancing, using the wreckage as cover. He needed to buy more time. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and threw it. Boom. The explosion sent metal flying, forcing the soldiers to scatter. Taking the chance, Daniel sprinted toward the ship. Zara, tell me you've got this thing running, he shouted. The ship's lights flared as the engines roared to life. Zara smirked. Get in. Daniel didn't hesitate. He jumped into the co-pilot's seat just as the soldiers opened fire again. Bullets bounced off the hull as Zara gripped the controls. Hold on, she warned. The ship lifted off the ground, debris swirling in the force of the engines. Daniel strapped in as Zara punched the thrusters. The interceptor shot into the sky like a comet, leaving the soldiers behind. For a moment, Daniel exhaled in relief. We made it. Zara gave him a sideways glance. Not yet. A red light flashed on the console. Multiple signals appeared behind them. Human fighters launching in pursuit. Daniel groaned. Of course. Zara switched the ship to battle mode. I hope you can shoot, human. Daniel grinned, gripping the weapon's controls. Watch me. The enemy fighters closed in, and the chase began. The dead Ravager lay at their feet, its thick hide still steaming under the cold night air. Zara stood over the creature, gripping her blade tightly. Though she was still weak, her attack had been fast, precise, lethal. Daniel lowered his rifle, shaking his head in disbelief. You really don't do helpless, do you? Zara smirked slightly. Did you expect me to hide behind you? Not anymore, Daniel admitted. She wiped the dark blood from her blade and sat down, breathing heavily. The fight had drained what little energy she had left. Daniel knelt beside her, checking the wound on her side. It hadn't reopened, but she was clearly exhausted. We should keep moving, Zara said, though her body betrayed her words. Daniel shook his head. Not until you rest. You may be a badass princess warrior, but even you have limits. She looked at him, debating whether to argue. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back against the wreckage. Fine, but only for a short time. Daniel sat nearby, his rifle resting on his knee. The wasteland around them was eerily quiet. No human patrols, no auxiliary search teams, but he knew it wouldn't last. After a few moments, Zara broke the silence. What will you do after this? Daniel glanced at her. After what? After we escape. Daniel let out a dry laugh. Escape to where? I just betrayed my own people by saving you. If they find me, I'm dead. And if your people find me, I'm also dead." Zira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There may be a way." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath. "If I can return to my people, I can stop them from executing you." Daniel frowned. "If?" Zira's gaze hardened. "My father, the Xilari High King, believes I am dead. If he learns I was saved by a human, it will not be easy to convince him to spare you. But if I can prove my survival is more valuable than revenge, he may listen." Daniel let out a low whistle. "So, my best shot at living is trusting an alien princess to convince her warlord father not to kill me." Zira gave him a sharp look. "It is better than running until both sides hunt you down." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She had a point. He had no home to return to, no army to rely on. The war had already made him an outcast. Maybe this was his only option. Finally, he nodded. "All right, princess. Let's say I trust you. How do we get to your people without getting killed?" Zira's violet eyes gleamed with determination. "We find a ship, and we fly straight into the heart of enemy territory." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that sounds insane." Zira smirked. "Then it is our only choice."